The listening lamp flickers to life, illuminating the space between worlds. Here, science whispers to spirit, and reality bends to imagination. Curl up in the cosmic glow as we unveil the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The Neighbour, a short story written by Rob Corrigan, narrated by John Kidd.
The January wind whistled through the gaps in Max's moving van, making the empty cardboard boxes dance across the cargo area. He watched them through the rearview mirror, each box a hollow echo of his former life. The city rose around him in steel and glass, his new building wedged between a Vietnamese restaurant and an ancient bookstore like an afterthought. Apartment 4B. The brass numbers hung slightly crooked on the door, the kind of detail that would normally bother him, but today felt strangely appropriate. Max balanced a box of kitchen supplies against his hip as he worked the key, hearing the soft click of tumblers falling into place. The sound seemed to linger longer than it should. Inside, afternoon light painted geometric patterns across bare hardwood floors. The apartment was small but efficient, a single bedroom, an open-plan living area, and windows that faced directly into the building across the narrow alley. Max set down his box, the thud echoing in a way that suggested the walls were listening. "Fresh start," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding foreign in the empty space. After all, this was a chance to rebuild after his girlfriend suggested they take a break. His career had occupied too much of his life, which brought the inevitable strain to their relationship. New city, new job, new Max. The first sign that something was different about this building came as he carried up his second load of boxes. A movement caught his eye through the window. An elderly woman in the building across the way, apartment 4A. She stood perfectly still, watching him with an intensity that made him pause mid-step. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her posture suggesting someone much younger than her apparent age. Max raised his hand in an awkward wave. The woman didn't respond, didn't even blink, just continued watching with that unsettling focus until he moved out of view. "Oh, that's Emma," said Mrs. Chen from 4C when he asked later, as she watered the plants that seemed to occupy every available surface in the hospital-like hallway of their apartment building. "She moved in about 6 months ago, very quiet, never says a word to anyone." "Never?" Max found himself glancing toward 4A's door, noticing how the brass numbers here were perfectly aligned. "Not once," Mrs. Chen confirmed, her expression suggesting both concern and reverence. "But she listens. Oh, she listens very carefully." She turned back to her plants, humming a tune that seemed to make the leaves shift toward her. "My grandmother would say that some souls need time to wander, but they find their way back when they're ready." Max found the comment to be strange and unsettling, but he decided not to press. That evening, as Max unpacked his kitchenware, he felt the weight of observation. Emma stood at her window again, silhouetted against warm light. He tried to focus on his task, but his eyes kept drifting up, drawn by her stillness. There was something almost mathematical about the way she held herself, as if she occupied her space according to some precise formula. The last box contained his books. Philosophy texts from his undergraduate days before law school had redirected his path. As he shelved them, a shadow fell across the spines despite no apparent change in the light outside. His fingers brushed against a volume he didn't recognize, The Silence Between Moments, by E.J. Blackwood. Max frowned. He was certain he hadn't packed this book, would have remembered such an enigmatic title. Opening it released a scent like old paper and winter mornings. The copyright page listed a publication date that seemed to blur when he tried to read it. A movement drew his attention back to the window. Emma had shifted slightly, one hand pressed against the glass. Their eyes met across the alley, and Max felt a strange sensation, as if time itself had developed a stutter. The book in his hands grew warm. When he looked down, a piece of paper had appeared between its pages, thick, cream-colored stationery covered in elegant handwriting. "Welcome to the building, Max. The silence here has been waiting for you." He jerked his head up, but Emma's window was empty now. The light in her apartment had changed, though the sun hadn't moved. His own reflection stared back at him, overlaid on the glass like a double exposure. Max carefully placed the book on his shelf, trying to convince himself he was just tired from moving, that the strange note was some sort of welcome message from the building management. But as night settled over the city, he found himself drawn back to the window, watching Emma's apartment for any sign of movement. The silence in his new home felt alive somehow, waiting. In the hallway, Mrs. Chen's plants cast shadows that seemed to spell out words when he wasn't looking directly at them, and somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, timepieces ticked in perfect synchronization, counting down to something he couldn't yet understand. Max turned away from the window, but not before he saw Emma watching again, her stillness a question he didn't know how to answer. Not yet. The night ahead stretched long and quiet, full of possibilities that whispered in the spaces between seconds. His new life was beginning, but already he suspected it would unfold in ways his carefully ordered mind could never have predicted. In the darkness, the book on his shelf seemed to pulse gently, like a beacon or a warning. The first pattern Max noticed was the tea. Every morning at precisely 7:43, Emma would appear at her window with a blue porcelain cup. Steam rose from it in spirals that seemed to hold their shape longer than physics should allow. She would take exactly 3 sips, each precisely 4 minutes apart, before setting the cup down on a small table that Max could never quite see clearly. He began documenting these observations in a small notebook, the kind he'd once used for client depositions. His legal training made him particular about details. Day 4. Emma wears the same grey cardigan. Fabric seems to shift between wool and something else when viewed peripherally. Tea steam forms double helix pattern. Day 7. Cup appears to contain different tea each day, though color remains consistent. Mrs. Chen's plants lean toward Emma's window during tea ritual. Day 9. Notice timeline discrepancy. Watch shows 7:39 when Emma appears, but building's clock reads 7:43. Both timepieces verified accurate. It was on day 12 that Max discovered the first article. He'd finally given in to his curiosity and searched Emma's name online, though he wasn't sure why he assumed the silent woman was the E.J. Blackwood from the mysterious book. The academic journal's website looked ancient, its text occasionally shifting into symbols he couldn't quite read. Dr. Emma Jane Blackwood's groundbreaking work on temporal consciousness revolutionized our understanding of subjective time, the article began. Her disappearance following the publication of The Silence Between Moments remains one of philosophy's great mysteries. Max leaned closer to his laptop screen, but the rest of the text became increasingly illegible, as if the words were attempting to exist in multiple languages simultaneously. Only fragments remained clear. Theory of observational causality. Experiments in Conscious Temporal Manipulation. Final lecture series on the mathematics of silence. A soft thud interrupted his reading. Emma had set down her cup, but something was different today. She held a book that looked identical to the one that had appeared on his shelf. As he watched, she opened it to what seemed to be the exact page where he'd found the welcome note. Max's neck prickled. He reached for his own copy of the book, but his hand froze mid-motion. The shadows in his apartment had changed, though the sun's position remained constant. They now pointed toward his desk, where a stack of papers had appeared that he definitely hadn't placed there. The top sheet contained a newspaper clipping, aged and yellowed. Philosopher's Final Theory Challenges Nature of Reality. Dr. E.J. Blackwood claims silence is not absence but presence. Below the headline, a photograph showed a younger Emma standing at a podium. Her expression held the same intensity he saw in her daily observations. But there was something else, a hint of anticipation, as if she had been waiting for a particular moment to arrive. The date on the clipping seemed to change each time he tried to read it. A movement caught his attention. Emma had turned to face him directly, her book still open. Max felt a sudden vertigo, as if the space between their windows had both expanded and contracted. The air in his apartment grew thick with possibility. Without conscious thought, he found himself writing in his notebook. The silence is not empty. It's full of something waiting to be understood. The words appeared in his handwriting but didn't feel like his own thoughts. When he looked up again, Emma had vanished, but her cup remained, somehow visible with perfect clarity despite the distance and angle. Max spent the rest of the morning researching, though each new piece of information seemed to raise more questions. Emma's academic career was documented in fragments that resisted coherent assembly. Her published works appeared in impossible journals. Citations led to papers that existed only in theoretical reference systems. At precisely 12:17, Mrs. Chen knocked on his door. "She was very famous, you know," the old woman said, without preamble, her arms full of potted herbs that seemed to twist toward Emma's window, before she chose the silence. "What do you mean, chose?" Max asked, but Mrs. Chen only smiled, her eyes reflecting something that might have been starlight, despite the midday sun. "Watch the patterns," she said finally. "They're there for those who know how to look." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Max? Time behaves differently when she's watching. Best keep track of the discrepancies." After she left, Max returned to his notebook, adding observations with increasingly unsteady hands. Teacup remains visible across impossible distance. Shadows move independent of light source. Mrs. Chen's plants exhibit non-standard growth patterns. Own memories of morning becoming unclear. Multiple versions seem to exist simultaneously. He looked up at Emma's window again. The cup had vanished, but a new pattern had formed in the condensation on the glass. From his angle, it appeared to be a complex equation, though the symbols kept rearranging themselves into different but equally meaningful configurations. Max reached for the silence between moments, thinking to compare the equation with anything in the text, but the book, like Emma herself, had vanished, though he could have sworn he felt its weight on the shelf, waiting to be discovered again when the time was right. In the hallway, Mrs. Chen's plants whispered among themselves, their leaves spelling out fragments of Emma's theories in ancient alphabets that existed only in the space between seconds. Max added one final note before closing his notebook. "Beginning to suspect I'm not just observing patterns. The patterns are observing me." The day stretched ahead, full of silence that felt increasingly like a conversation he was only beginning to understand. The idea of writing to Emma came to Max at 3:17 a.m., that hollow hour when loneliness feels most solid. He sat at his desk, the city's ambient light casting strange shadows across the blank page before him. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, each word feeling more consequential than it should. Dear Emma, I've been watching the silence. I think it's watching back. Max. Simple, direct. Yet as he wrote the final letter, the ink seemed to shimmer, as if the words were attempting to exist in multiple forms simultaneously. Max folded the note carefully, using precise creases that reminded him of the origami his mother had taught him before she disappeared into her own kind of silence. Morning brought doubt with its weak winter light. The note felt childish now, sitting on his desk like an accusation. Through his window, he could see Emma's apartment was dark, though her teacup sat in its usual spot, steam rising in impossible patterns. This is ridiculous, he muttered, reaching for the note, but his fingers brushed only empty desk. The paper had vanished. Max's heart stuttered. He distinctly remembered placing it there, remembered the exact position, remembered. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Emma stood at her window, holding what appeared to be his note. As he watched, she unfolded it with careful precision, her movements exact mirrors of his own from hours before. She read it once, then again, then turned to face him directly. The air between their windows grew thick with potential. Max felt a familiar sensation creeping up his spine, the same hollow ache he'd felt when Sarah, his girlfriend of 7 years, suggested they take a break. It was his fault and he knew it. The memory felt fresh enough to bruise. Emma's expression didn't change, but somehow he knew she could sense his pain. She pressed one hand against the glass, and for a moment, Max could have sworn he saw other versions of himself reflected in the window. Younger, older, happier, more broken, all existing simultaneously. When he blinked, she was gone. But something had appeared on his desk, a piece of thick cream paper covered in elegant script that seemed to write itself as he watched. Dear Max, the silence watches because it remembers. What do you remember when you let yourself be still? E. He read the words repeatedly, each time finding new meanings layered beneath the surface. The paper felt warm, as if it had just been written, though he hadn't seen Emma hold a pen. His phone buzzed, startling him. A text from his mother, the first in months. Thinking of you today. Do you remember the paper birds? Max's hands shook as he set down the phone. He hadn't thought about the origami in years, had deliberately packed those memories away with other artifacts of his mother's slow fade into silence after his father's death. Yet here they were, surfacing just as Emma asked about remembering. Almost without conscious thought, he found himself folding another note. The paper moved beneath his fingers as if it knew the shape it wanted to become. The memories hurt less in the silence. Is that why you chose it? This time he watched as the note vanished, dissolving like sugar in hot tea. Through his window, he saw Emma reading words that had never physically crossed the space between them. Her response appeared differently, letters forming in the condensation on his own window, written from the inside. Pain is just another pattern, Max. Learn to observe it without attachment, and you'll see what hides beneath. The words faded even as he read them, but they left an impression deeper than mere memory. Max found himself thinking of Sarah, of his mother, of all the silences he'd failed to understand. Had they been trying to show him something, just as Emma was? His reflection in the window shifted, showing him moments he'd tried to forget. Sarah's face when she realized he'd chosen work over their relationship once too often. His mother's careful folding of paper birds, each one carrying a message he'd been too young to read. The exact moment he'd decided that success meant more than connection. Emma appeared in her window again, watching him confront these fragments of his past. Her stillness felt supportive now, rather than unsettling. She held up a new note, but instead of words, it contained an intricate origami bird, identical to the ones his mother had made. Max reached for his notebook, needing to document this impossible moment, but found himself writing something else entirely. The silence isn't empty. It's full of everything we try not to hear. The words appeared in his handwriting but carried Emma's cadence. When he looked up, the light in both their apartments had changed, though the sun hadn't moved. Time felt soft around the edges, malleable in ways his logical mind struggled to accept. A final note materialized on his desk, the paper thin as memory. Tomorrow, we'll discuss time. For now, just listen to the spaces between your thoughts. They have more to teach than any words I could write. Max sat in his apartment as evening gathered, feeling the silence expand to fill all the hollow places inside him. Somewhere, a clock struck an hour that didn't exist. Through his window, Emma's teacup continued sending spiral messages in steam that smelled like childhood and possibility. He had so many questions, but for the first time in years, he was learning to let them sit unanswered. The silence had its own wisdom, if he could just learn to listen properly. In the growing dark, he folded one more note, not to send, but to remember. Dear self, the patterns were always there, I just couldn't see them through the noise. M. The paper bird he created caught the last light like a promise, casting shadows that spelled out truths he was only beginning to understand. Max hadn't expected Dr. Catherine Gibson to look so ordinary. The former colleague of Emma's sat across from him in a university cafe, stirring her tea in precisely timed circles. 3 stirs clockwise, pause, 3 counterclockwise. The motion reminded him of Emma's morning ritual, though he couldn't explain why. I haven't spoken about Emma in years, Catherine said, her voice carrying undertones that seemed to resonate with the cafe's ambient noise. Not since the symposium. The one where she presented her final paper, Max asked, consulting his notes. The cafe's lights flickered briefly, though no one else seemed to notice. Catherine's hand paused mid-stir. How do you know about that? The records were lost. The last word stretched slightly, as if attempting to cover something else. I found references, Max said carefully. He didn't mention how the articles appeared and disappeared from his browser history, or how his searches sometimes returned results in languages that shouldn't exist. Her theory about observational causality. Stop. Catherine set down her spoon with deliberate precision. Those ideas weren't meant for casual discussion. Emma understood the risks of certain knowledge. That's why she caught herself, glancing at the window where frost was forming in complex mathematical patterns. Max pulled out his notebook, opening to the pages of observations he'd collected over the past weeks. Strange incidents in his apartment had become nearly daily occurrences, books rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. Clocks running at different speeds, depending on which window they were visible from. His own reflections sometimes showing up seconds after his movements. Notes appearing in his own handwriting that he had no memory of writing. She's not just silent, he said quietly. She's doing something with time itself, isn't she? Catherine's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on resignation. Emma always said that silence was a form of time, that if you could learn to listen properly. She trailed off, watching as her tea's steam formed double helixes in the air. Have you read her book? The real one, I mean. Max thought of the copy that appeared and disappeared from his shelf. I'm not sure. If you had, you'd know. Catherine reached into her bag, withdrawing a worn leather journal. This was her research diary. She left it with me the day before she chose. She placed it on the table between them, but didn't remove her hand. I shouldn't give you this, but the patterns suggest I already have. The journal hummed with potential energy. As Catherine's fingers lifted, Max saw multiple versions of the book existing simultaneously, some more solid than others, all somehow equally real. One warning, Catherine said, standing. Time behaves differently around those pages. Don't read them all at once, and never after midnight. Emma learned that lesson the hard way. She gathered her things, then paused. And Max, if you see her, tell her some of us understood, even at the end. She left Max sitting there, the journal pulsing gently beneath his hands. Around him, the cafe's ambient noise had taken on rhythmic qualities that reminded him of Emma's silent observations. Back in his apartment, the journal seemed to resist being opened. Each page required conscious effort, as if the paper itself existed in multiple states until observed. Emma's handwriting flowed across the pages in elegant spirals. Day 147. The silence has mass. It can be measured in memories and moments. Each observation creates ripples through time. Day 203. Discovered why the tea must be at precisely 73.4 degrees. Temperature affects temporal viscosity. Day 289. The building holds patterns I never expected. Its angles intersect with time in ways that defy standard geometry. Max looked up from his reading to find his apartment filled with strange light. The shadows had shifted, forming shapes that reminded him of Emma's equations. Through his window, he could see her standing in her usual spot, but something was different. Her form seemed less substantial, as if she were distributing herself across multiple moments. A new note appeared on his desk, the paper aging and rejuvenating as he watched. Now you begin to see, but seeing changes what is seen. Be careful with Catherine's gift. Some knowledge can't be unlearned. The words faded even as he read them, leaving behind a scent like old books and winter roses. Max turned back to the journal, but the pages had gone blank, all except one, which held a single line in Emma's elegant script. Time is not a river, but a sea. We drown not in its flow, but in its depth. Outside his window, Emma raised her hand in that familiar gesture of acknowledgement. Behind her, Max could see other versions of her apartment, some from years past, some possibly from futures that hadn't happened yet, all existing simultaneously, all somehow equally true. His own apartment felt less solid now, its boundaries becoming permeable to something he was only beginning to understand. In the hallway, he heard Mrs. Chen's plants whispering equations that sounded like Emma's theories, translated into chlorophyll and cellulose. The journal sat closed on his desk, waiting. Max checked his watch, thinking to resume reading, but the hands spun in opposite directions before settling on an impossible hour. Through the wall, he heard Catherine's warning echo from both the past and future simultaneously. Some knowledge can't be unlearned. Night was falling, or perhaps rising. Time had become difficult to track in the building's strange angles. Max carefully placed the journal beside The Silence Between Moments on his shelf, watching as both books seemed to synchronize their existence. Emma's window had gone dark, but her presence lingered in the quality of silence that filled his apartment. Max added one final observation to his notebook before the day's light failed completely. Beginning to understand why she chose silence, some truths can only be heard when everything else falls away. The night ahead stretched like theory given form, full of possibilities that existed in superposition until observed. Max sat in his darkening apartment, listening to the building breathe in patterns that Emma had discovered long ago. Understanding was coming, but with it came questions that whispered in frequencies he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. The manuscript arrived at 3:33 a.m., materializing on Max's desk in a manner that should have been impossible, but now felt almost expected. The stack of papers gave off a faint luminescence, like moonlight captured on paper. Each page appeared to be typed on an ancient typewriter, though the ink remained fresh enough to smudge under his trembling fingers. The Mathematics of Silence, A Theory of Temporal Consciousness, by Dr. Emma J. Blackwood. Unpublished, final draft. Max recognized it instantly, the legendary lost work that Catherine had mentioned, the one that had supposedly driven 3 peer reviewers to resign from academia. His hands shook as he turned to the first page. Time is not what we think it is. Neither is silence. Both are forms of the same substance, and both can be manipulated through careful observation. The words seemed to shift beneath his gaze, rearranging themselves into deeper truths when viewed peripherally. Max's phone buzzed, another message from his boss about missed deadlines and concerning behavior. He ignored it, too captivated by what he was reading. Emma's theories unfolded like origami in reverse, each page revealing complexities nested within complexities. She wrote about the quantum nature of consciousness, the mathematical properties of memory, the way silence could be used to create spaces where time behaved differently. The observer effect applies not just to particles, but to moments themselves, one passage read. By choosing where and how to place our attention, we literally shape the temporal landscape around us. Through his window, Max could see Emma in her apartment, mirroring his reading posture exactly. She held what appeared to be the same manuscript, though her copy seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Their eyes met across the alley, and Max felt that familiar sensation of time stuttering around them. A note appeared between the manuscript's pages. Be careful how deeply you read. Understanding changes more than just the mind. Even as he processed these words, Max began noticing changes in his apartment. His furniture cast shadows that didn't match the light sources. The walls seemed to breathe in patterns matching Emma's theories about temporal resonance. His own reflection in the window showed events that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps had happened in other versions of reality. His work phone rang again, but the sound degraded into mathematical equations that floated visible in the air. Max realized he hadn't been to the office in how long? Days felt simultaneously compressed and expanded, as if time itself was adjusting to accommodate his study of Emma's work. Page 147. The building serves as both laboratory and proof, he read, the words glowing softly. Its angles intersect with time in ways that create natural observation chambers. Each apartment exists in multiple states until observed, allowing for... The text blurred, then clarified into a complex diagram showing the building's impossible geometry. Max recognized his own apartment, but the plans showed it occupying several temporal coordinates simultaneously. Emma's apartment appeared as a nexus point where multiple timelines converged. A movement caught his attention. Mrs. Chen stood in his doorway, though he hadn't heard her enter. The plants she carried seemed to grow and decay in accelerated cycles. "You found it then," she said, her voice harmonizing with frequencies Max could suddenly perceive. "Her final work, the one that proved too much." "What happened to her?" Max asked. "After she published this?" Mrs. Chen's smile contained multitudes. "Published? Oh no, dear. She never published it. She became it." She gestured to Emma's window, where their neighbor appeared to be reading and not reading the manuscript in infinite regression. "I don't understand," Max said, but even as the words left his mouth, understanding began to crystallize. The manuscript's pages turned on their own, revealing passages that explained everything and nothing. The ultimate observer effect requires ultimate commitment. To truly understand time's malleable nature, one must step outside its conventional flow. Max's head spun as implications cascaded through his consciousness. His own research into Emma, his growing awareness of the building's strange properties, the way time seemed to bend around their interactions. It all formed a pattern he was only now beginning to perceive. "She's not just observing," he whispered. "She's conducting an ongoing experiment, and we're all part of it." Mrs. Chen nodded, her form flickering between different ages. "Now you begin to see, but seeing has consequences. Are you prepared for them?" Before Max could answer, his work phone rang one final time. The sound shattered something in the air, and suddenly his apartment was empty. No Mrs. Chen, no plants, no manuscript. Only a single page remained on his desk, containing a handwritten note. "The choice comes soon. Watch carefully. Your observation will determine more than you know." Through his window, Emma stood watching, her form superimposed with infinite versions of herself. The manuscript had vanished, but its effects lingered in the way reality seemed less solid, more provisional. Max's phone showed 17 missed calls from work, but the timestamps appeared impossible. Some from years ago, some from hours that hadn't happened yet. His carefully constructed professional life was unraveling, but he found he cared less about that than understanding what Emma was trying to show him. He opened his notebook to document these events, but found pages of notes written in his hand that he had no memory of writing. Each entry detailed observations of time distortions, consciousness experiments, and the mathematical properties of silence. Night fell in quantum superposition, existing as both evening and morning until Max chose to observe it properly. In the growing darkness, he could hear Emma's manuscript whispering from wherever it had gone, its theories becoming reality in the spaces between moments. The choice was coming, just as she'd warned. But first, he had to understand exactly what he was choosing between. In the hallway, Mrs. Chen's plants grew in patterns that spelled out equations in Emma's elegant mathematical language, their leaves turning to face a sun that hadn't risen yet. The mirror in Max's bathroom had started showing different versions of his life. It began subtly, a tie he hadn't chosen to wear, a coffee cup he didn't remember buying. But on this particular morning, his reflection showed him standing in a corner office at his old firm, accepting a partnership offer he had never received. "That could have been you," the reflection seemed to say. The Max in the mirror looked successful, polished, empty. Behind him, visible in the mirror but not in his actual bathroom, Emma stood watching. Her expression held something between pity and understanding. When Max turned to look, he was alone, but the mirror continued showing alternate versions of his life playing out in infinite regression. His phone buzzed, a final warning from his current employer about unexplained absences and declining performance. Max stared at the message, seeing not just the words, but the branching possibilities they represented. In one timeline, he was already fired. In another, he had never taken this job at all. Both felt equally real. Time isn't linear, he remembered from Emma's manuscript. It spirals, loops, doubles back on itself. Our choices don't eliminate other possibilities. They just determine which version we observe. A note materialized on his sink. Now you see why silence became necessary. Words anchor us to single timelines, but in silence, all possibilities remain open. The paper dissolved into steam that smelled like memory and potential. Max's reflection fractured into multiple versions, each showing a different choice he had made or might make. Staying with Sarah, building a life of quiet compromise. Following his mother into academic philosophy. Taking that partnership, letting success fill the hollow places. Walking away from everything to understand what Emma was offering. Too many choices, he whispered to his splintered reflections. Too many versions. Only if you try to hold them all, came Emma's voice, though she remained invisible. The sound seemed to stabilize reality briefly, bringing all possibilities into sharp focus before letting them blur again. Max made his way to his desk, where his notebook waited. The pages contained observations written by different versions of himself. Day 45. The building exists in quantum superposition. Each apartment occupies multiple temporal coordinates simultaneously. Day 45. There is no building. There is only observation and its effects on space-time. Day 45. Everything is reflection. Nothing is reflection. The truth lies in the space between. His head ached from trying to reconcile these contradictory truths. Through his window, he could see Emma's apartment existing in multiple states: empty, occupied, under construction, abandoned, all simultaneously true until observed. Mrs. Chen's voice carried through his wall, though he knew she wasn't home. The choice collapses the waveform, dear, but you have to understand what you're choosing between. Max's phone rang again. Sarah this time. Her contact photo showed her as she had been, as she was now in some other timeline, as she might have been if he had chosen differently. He let it ring, watching the possibilities spiral out from this moment of non-action. His reflection in the window caught his attention. The Max looking back at him seemed older, wiser, more at peace with uncertainty. Behind this version of himself, he could see Emma nodding in approval. Understanding comes, her note appeared on his desk, when you stop trying to force reality into single timelines. Max looked down at his hands, seeing them both aged and young, steady and trembling. The boundaries of his self felt increasingly permeable, as if his consciousness was expanding to accommodate multiple versions of reality. His workplace ID card lay on the desk, a tether to the life he had been trying to maintain. As he watched, it seemed to age and crumble, then restore itself, existing in multiple states like everything else in the building. A final note appeared, written in what looked like his own handwriting from a future he hadn't lived yet. The reflection shows what could be. The silence shows what is. The choice is which truth you're ready to observe. Through his window, Emma stood in her usual spot, but now Max could see her as she truly was, not just an elderly woman, but a nexus of possibilities, a living experiment in consciousness and observation. She had chosen to step outside conventional time, to exist in the silence between moments, Was he ready to understand what that really meant? His phone buzzed one last time, a final calendar reminder for a meeting he would never attend. Max watched it fade into static, taking with it another thread connecting him to the life he had thought he wanted. The mirror in his bathroom still showed infinite possibilities, but they no longer felt overwhelming. They were just reflections of choices, each as real as his willingness to observe them. Night fell in quantum superposition, existing as both dusk and dawn until Max chose which to perceive. In the growing darkness, he could feel the weight of Emma's observation, teaching him to see beyond single moments into the vast silence where all possibilities lived. The choice was coming, but first he had to decide which version of himself would be making it. In the hallway, Mrs. Chen's plants grew in patterns that mapped the geography of possible futures, their shadows spelling out truths that existed independent of observation. Max sat at his desk, surrounded by versions of his life that had been and might be, learning to find peace in the spaces between certainties. The breaking point came at sunset, or perhaps dawn. Time had become increasingly unreliable in the building. Max sat at his desk, surrounded by fragments of his former life. Resignation letters he may or may not have sent, phone messages he might have received, versions of himself he could have been. The mirror had given up any pretense of normality, now showing not just reflections, but windows into other timelines. Max watched himself living 1,000 different lives, each as real as the one he currently occupied. In some, he was successful but empty. In others, fulfilled but struggling. The possibilities radiated out like ripples in a temporal pond. Through his window, Emma's apartment seemed to pulse with a strange light that existed somewhere between visible and theoretical. She stood in her usual spot, but her form had become almost transparent. "I understand now," Max whispered, though he wasn't sure which version of himself was speaking. The words appeared in his notebook in handwriting that spanned several timelines. "The silence is not an absence but a presence. It's the space where all possibilities exist simultaneously." A final note materialized on his desk, the paper somehow both ancient and newly created. "Time for the threshold, Max. Are you ready to step through?" The air in his apartment grew thick with potential. Objects began to lose their solidity, existing in multiple states, until observed. Max felt reality flex around him, bending in ways that should have been impossible, but now felt inevitable. Mrs. Chen appeared in his doorway, though the door hadn't opened. The plants she carried grew and decayed in endless cycles, their leaves spelling out equations in Emma's mathematical language. "She's been waiting," Mrs. Chen said, her voice harmonizing with frequencies that existed outside normal time. "The experiment requires another observer." "What experiment?" Max asked, but even as the words left his mouth, understanding bloomed in his consciousness. The building, the silence, Emma's disappearance from public life. It was all part of something larger, something he had been preparing to understand since the moment he moved in. His phone rang one last time. Sarah again, or perhaps his mother, or his former boss. The sound degraded into pure mathematics, equations floating visible in the air before dissolving into potential. Through his window, Emma beckoned. Her apartment had become a nexus point where multiple timelines converged, creating a space that existed outside conventional reality. Max could see how the building's geometry made this possible, its angles intersecting with time in ways that defied standard physics. The choice, Emma's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, is whether to observe or be observed, whether to exist in one timeline or acknowledge them all. Max felt reality shiver around him. His apartment began to overlap with other versions of itself, the office he might have had, the home he could have shared with Sarah, the study where he might have followed his philosophical interests, all existing simultaneously, all equally valid until observed. "You have to choose," Mrs. Chen said gently. "But remember, choosing one possibility doesn't negate the others. It just determines which truth you're ready to witness." Max stood, feeling the weight of multiple lives pressing against his consciousness. His reflection in the window showed not just himself, but all the selves he could have been, had been, might yet be. Behind him, Emma's form grew more distinct, as if his understanding was helping her maintain coherence across timelines. The threshold became visible then, not a physical doorway, but a point where realities intersected. Through it, Max could see the truth of Emma's experiment. She had found a way to exist in the silence between moments, to observe all possibilities without being bound by any of them. "But the experiment requires balance," Emma's voice explained. "For every observer who steps outside time, another must remain to maintain the connection to linear reality." Max looked at his notebook one last time. The pages had filled themselves with observations from every possible version of himself, creating a map of consciousness that spanned multiple dimensions of existence. "I see the pattern," he said, his voice resonating across timelines. The air around him began to crystallize into geometric shapes that represented choices, possibilities, moments of decision that rippled through reality. Emma nodded, her form stabilizing briefly. "The threshold awaits, but remember, some choices can't be unmade." Behind him, his phone rang again, anchoring him to the life he had known. Ahead, the threshold beckoned, offering understanding that transcended single moments of time. Max took a step forward, feeling reality flex around him. The building seemed to hold its breath, its impossible geometry creating the perfect space for what came next. Mrs. Chen's plants grew in patterns that mapped the decision's quantum possibilities, their shadows spelling out truths that existed independent of observation. The choice hung in the air like suspended time, waiting for Max to determine which version of reality he was ready to observe. Behind him, his old life began to fade into quantum uncertainty. Ahead, Emma waited in the silence between moments, ready to show him what existence looked like from outside linear time. The threshold shimmered with potential, a doorway into understanding that would change everything, or perhaps had already changed it in some other version of now. Max took another step forward, feeling the weight of infinite possibilities pressing against his consciousness. The choice was his. Or perhaps it had always been made, waiting only for him to observe it. The first thing Max noticed after crossing the threshold was the quality of silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something deeper, a resonance that existed between moments, between choices, between the infinite versions of reality that lay stacked like pages in an endless book. His apartment still existed, but now he could see it for what it truly was, a node in a vast network of possibilities, each one as real as his ability to perceive it. The walls breathed mathematics, Emma's equations made manifest in the architecture of space-time itself. "Welcome," Emma said, her voice carrying harmonics that stretched across multiple timelines. She stood before him, more present than he had ever seen her, existing in a state of perfect coherence across all possible moments. "Now you can begin to understand." Max watched as reality shifted around them. His consciousness expanded to accommodate perspectives that should have been impossible. He saw himself from yesterday and tomorrow simultaneously, perceived choices he had made and unmade, experienced the quantum superposition of every possible version of his life. "It's overwhelming," he managed, his words creating ripples through the temporal fabric of the building. "Only because you're still trying to process it linearly," Emma explained. Her form flickered between ages, between versions, each one equally true. "Let go of sequence. Everything is now. Everything is simultaneous." As if in response to her words, Max felt his perception shift. The overwhelming flood of information resolved into patterns, into harmonies that made a strange kind of sense. He could see how each moment connected to every other, how choices created resonances that echoed through all possible timelines. Mrs. Chen appeared, or perhaps had always been there, her plants growing in fractal patterns that mapped the geography of consciousness itself. "You're starting to harmonize," she observed. "The resonance is taking hold." Through what had once been his window, Max could now see the true nature of the building. It wasn't just an apartment complex. It was an instrument, carefully designed to create spaces where reality could fold back on itself, where observation could transcend linear time. "Your work," he said to Emma, understanding blooming like quantum flowers in his mind. "The manuscript, the theories, this is what you were trying to explain." Emma nodded, her movement creating interference patterns in the fabric of space-time. Words were too limiting. Some truths can only be understood through direct observation. Max watched as his old life played out across infinite variations, the partnership he never accepted, the love he let slip away, the academic career he abandoned. But now he saw them not as losses or missed opportunities, but as different harmonics in a vast cosmic chord. The silence, he realized, it's not about absence, it's about hearing the resonance between all possible moments. "Yes," Emma's voice carried approval that spanned multiple dimensions. "And now you can help maintain it." Reality shifted again, showing Max the true nature of their role. The building needed observers who could perceive all possibilities simultaneously, who could help hold the space where linear time met quantum potential. Without them, the carefully constructed harmonies would collapse into chaos. Mrs. Chen's plants grew in patterns that spelled out fundamental truths. All moments exist simultaneously. Observation determines which ones manifest. The resonance must be maintained. Through what had once been windows, Max could see others in the building, not just as they appeared in linear time, but as the sum of all their possibilities. Each life was a melody in an infinite symphony, each choice a note that resonated through the quantum fabric of reality. "But what about—" Max thought of Sarah, of his mother, of all the connections that had anchored him to linear time. Emma's expression held infinite compassion. "They exist in their own harmonies, their own resonances. Our role is to observe, to maintain the space where all possibilities can coexist." The air around them crystallized into geometric patterns that represented the mathematics of consciousness itself. Max could see how his own awareness had become part of the building's quantum architecture, helping to hold open the spaces between moments. Mrs. Chen's voice carried the weight of ancient understanding. The resonance changes you. You become part of the harmony. Max felt the last threads of his linear perception dissolving, replaced by something larger, more comprehensive. He could still see his old life, still feel the pull of singular reality, but now he understood it as just one note in an infinite chord. Emma stood beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the quantum sea. "The choice isn't final," she said, reading his thoughts across multiple timelines. "You can still observe linear time. You just can't be bound by it anymore." Reality flexed around them, showing Max the truth of her words. He could see himself still living various versions of his old life, still making choices and experiencing consequences. But now he also saw the larger pattern, the resonance that connected all possible moments into a single eternal now. The building hummed with quantum potential, its spaces carefully maintained by observers who had learned to exist in the silence between moments. Max felt himself becoming part of that maintenance, his consciousness expanding to hold open the doorways between what was, what could be, and what had always been. Night fell in infinite variation, each possible sunset creating its own harmony in the quantum symphony. Through it all, Emma and Max stood in the spaces between moments, learning to maintain the resonance that kept reality from collapsing into single timelines. The silence deepened, not empty, but full of everything that could ever be, held in perfect harmony by those who had learned to observe it all at once. In what had once been the hallway, Mrs. Chen's plants grew in patterns that mapped the music of quantum consciousness, their leaves spelling out truths that existed beyond time itself. The resonance continued, eternal and immediate, maintained by those who had chosen to step outside linear time and hold open the spaces where all possibilities could exist simultaneously. Max settled into his new role, learning to be both observer and observed, part of the infinite harmony that kept reality from forgetting any of its possible songs. The steady beep of hospital monitors marked time in Sarah's vigil beside Max's bed. She watched his chest rise and fall, trying to find meaning in the rhythm of his breathing. The night shift had settled in, bringing with it the quiet presence of Nurse Chen. Dr. Gibson had explained the coma in careful clinical terms, something about a quantum state between consciousness and unconsciousness, but it was Nurse Chen who brought real comfort during these long nights. The elderly nurse moved through the room with quiet efficiency, her presence somehow making the sterile space feel more like a sanctuary than a hospital room. "My grandmother always said that healing happens in its own time," Nurse Chen told them softly as she checked Max's vitals. Her gentle hands moved with practiced precision, while the plants she tended on the windowsill brought life to the otherwise stark room. Max's mother sat in the chair opposite Sarah, absently turning a photograph in her hands. She'd found it while going through Max's apartment, tucked inside his journal full of philosophical musings about time and consciousness. The hospital photograph, dated 50 years ago, showed Nurse Chen, looking exactly as she did now, standing beside an elderly woman whose serene expression caught the eye. "I asked her about it," Max's mother said quietly. The woman in the photo, Nurse Chen just smiled and said some people touch our lives in ways we can't explain. She carefully returned the photograph to her purse, then reached out to smooth Max's blanket with maternal tenderness. Sarah thought about the journal entries she'd found in Max's apartment, his observations about an elderly neighbor named Emma, who no one else seemed to remember. His writing had grown increasingly philosophical in the weeks before the accident, filled with thoughts about time and consciousness that now seemed strangely prophetic. "He's not gone," Nurse Chen would assure them during her rounds. "He's just walking a different path right now." There was something in her voice that made such simple words carry deeper meaning. The nights were hardest. Sarah would find herself studying Max's face in the dim light, looking for any sign of change. Sometimes she thought she saw his eyes move beneath their lids, as if he were watching something in a dream. "Talk to him," Nurse Chen encouraged. "The silence between words carries more than we know." She tended her plants as she spoke, her movements precise and purposeful. The greenery seemed to thrive under her care, bringing life to the window ledge. Sarah and Max's mother took turns reading to him, newspapers, novels, sometimes passages from his own journal. They held one-sided conversations, shared memories, and hoped their words reached wherever he had gone. "My grandmother would say that some souls need time to wander," Nurse Chen told them as she adjusted Max's pillows with practiced care, her ancient eyes full of gentle understanding. "But they find their way back when they're ready." Sarah often found herself watching Nurse Chen work, drawing comfort from the way she moved through the room with such certainty. There was something timeless about her presence, as if she carried wisdom that went beyond her role as a night nurse. Max's mother kept the old photograph close, sometimes studying it as if it might hold answers. The elderly woman standing beside Nurse Chen seemed to radiate a calm that felt familiar somehow, though neither Sarah nor Max's mother could explain why. "Sometimes," Nurse Chen said as she finished her rounds, "the greatest act of love is simply being present while someone finds their way back to themselves." Sarah squeezed Max's hand, feeling its warmth, taking comfort in the steady rise and fall of his chest. His mother reached across the bed to grasp her other hand, and they sat together in the quiet, waiting. Outside the window, the city carried on. Inside, time moved at its own pace, marked by the steady beep of monitors and the gentle rustle of leaves from Nurse Chen's plants. They held on to hope, not for any miraculous signs or impossible occurrences, but for the simple possibility of Max opening his eyes, of him finding his way back to them. And they waited, supported by Nurse Chen's quiet wisdom and gentle care, for whatever tomorrow might bring. The night deepened. Somewhere in the hospital, Nurse Chen continued her rounds, and in his bed, Max breathed steadily, taking whatever time he needed to return. Some mysteries, after all, solve themselves in their own way. Some answers come only with patience, and some hopes are best held simply in the quiet spaces between moments.
Thank you for illuminating your imagination with the listening lamp. If our tale has sparked a light in your mind, we invite you to keep that flame burning. Subscribe to our podcast and join us again as we continue to explore the vast cosmos of human experience. Until next time, may your inner light guide you through the mysteries that await.